Hello everyone. Since getting back from playing a lot of gigs on the road this summer at festivals, I have been hitting the studio pretty hard. I've got a tour coming up in Australia starting in November, and I'm working on a lot of tunes that I'm going to be dropping during that tour. So what I wanted to show you today is a little peek inside one of my works in progress. This is not a complete tune. It's not even mixed down yet. So what I'm showing you guys is basically a middle phase of the tune. I've got all of the arrangement done. I've got all of the sound design done. But you'll notice that the elements are very dry. There's very little in the way of EQ and compression. There's not much in the way of spatial effects and volume balancing and things like that. The tune is still relatively raw. What I plan on doing with it after this phase is exporting each track to audio so I can import it and mix it in Logic. Before we dig under the hood, I'll give you guys a little preview so you can see what kind of vibe the tune has. All right, so the first thing I'm going to show you how to do in this tune is to make some beats. The beats in this tune are pretty simple. We've got hi-hats, a snare drum, a kick drum, and then later on in the tune, some cowbell and jam blocks come in. But at the first drop, the tune's really simple. So let's check out the hi-hats first, because the hi-hats here, I am running out of FXPansions BFD2. I really, really like BFD because it's got some beautifully multi-sampled, very nice acoustic sounding drums. And in particular, I like to use it for hi-hats and toms. Because I find hi-hats sometimes challenging to do with audio samples because you don't usually get a very realistic sounding hi-hat. You end up kind of just playing one sample over and over again, maybe playing with the velocity, maybe putting in a couple of different samples, but it's a lot of work to get realistic sounding hi-hats. But with BFD, it's actually super easy. So let me just solo this for you guys and I'll play it. So if we look inside the MIDI clip, what's happening is I'm actually just playing the same note over and over and over again. And you can see it's at exactly the same velocity. But when you heard those hats actually sound a lot more realistic. There's actually different samples that are playing every hit. And that is because BFD is fully velocity sensitive. And when different velocities of MIDI notes come into it, it actually triggers different samples. It's called velocity switching. And how I'm doing that is with a MIDI velocity plugin from Ableton. And you can see I've cranked the randomness parameter up a little bit. So even though I'm sending the same velocity out of the MIDI clip for every note, the MIDI velocity plugin is actually randomizing that and feeding BFD a range of different velocities, which is humanizing the drums for me. And so those hi-hats sound much more realistic and much more human than I'd be able to get without a lot of work in a regular drum rack or something like that. So there's our hats. Next up, we're going to look at the snare. The snare drum is the boss in the percussion here. This is entirely snare-driven music. Everybody beat matches to the snare, and traditionally in glitch hop and bass music, the snare is like dubstep too. The snare is just where it's at. So it's the most important part of the percussion. And as you can see here, I'm using a drum rack. And this is a drum rack that I developed to do sound design for snares. Sometimes when I'm bored or if I'm not feeling inspired to work on a tune, then I'll just sit around and make drums. And this is basically a bank of a whole bunch of different sounds that I created. So inside this drum rack, in each one of these drum rack pads, is a sampler instrument, like so. And each sampler is loaded up with a whole bunch of different sounds. In this case, snare drums. In this case, toms. In this case, synthesized snare drums. and in this case, claps. And these are all different parts that I like to put together and layer together to make my, big fat snares. Now, the reason why I'm using samplers versus just dropping a regular sample in there is because I'm using a concept called 128s. This is a wicked concept designed by Dylan, Mr. Ill Gates, and he wanted to find a way to really quickly switch through audio samples to be able to preview them in context with your drums. And so he built this concept where you can macro the chain selector. There we go. Chain selector up here, which picks all your different samples. I have another YouTube video on this, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on how to set up 128s. You can either talk to Ill Gates or you can check out my video online. But what I am going to show you is each individual part and why I put them together like this. So I'm using each one of these 4 layers, and these macros, I've basically dialed these knobs into the point where I've found samples in each one of the banks that I really like. So here is our acoustic snare. Let's start off with that. Now, before I expose this sound, I'm going to go further back in the chain and shut some other stuff off. You can see I've got other plugins that are really impacting our sound. So I'm going to turn these guys off, all these racks and different plugins, and I'm just going to let you hear the raw sound. So here's our raw acoustic snare. A little bit different. First thing you'll notice is in the pitch OSC tab of the sampler, I'm using a pitch envelope on the snare. Okay, here's what it sounds like without. Here's with. And the reason I'm doing that is when you get into synthesizing percussion, like designing percussion from scratch with no audio input, like just using synths and stuff like that, you'll typically use, in this case of snares, you use white noise, and in the case of kicks, you usually use sine waves, and you use pitch envelopes because the very beginning of an audio sample of a drum is very high pitched. It gives you that thump, that kick, that bite to the front end of the note. And even though I am using an acoustic snare sample, which is a recording, I'm basically resynthesizing it with a pitch envelope because I find that even though the drum does have natural, stick on the membrane, it does crack on the front. This is electronic music. We want our drums to be as loud, as percussive, as transient as possible. We want them to really punch. And so I find that actually resynthesizing them with a pitch envelope from the sampler gives them even more crack to the front end. You'll also notice that I'm pitching the sample over here. And the reason I'm doing that is to tune the sample in key with my track here. And you'll see at the back of the chain here, I'm using a Spectrum plugin. And if we expand the Spectrum plugin up so you can see full screen, when I kick that sample in, you can see where it's hitting. It's hitting right here, which is G sharp 2, which is in tune with our key. So you can see right down here in the bottom left what the actual note is based on where it's peaking. So I've tuned the sample as well. So let's just back out and go to our acoustic tom. So our acoustic tom sounds like this. And I have a pitch envelope that I'm using on that as well. And again, notice the difference. I'll comment here on the pitch envelope. I really like Ableton's sampler instrument because it has a little bit more advanced pitch envelope than some other devices. You can see here it's got slopes on the different phases of the envelope. You have the regular phases. You've got attack, decay, release, sustain, things like that. So you can see I've dialed in a decay time of about 80 milliseconds here. But we've also got this little guy right here, which is called decay slope. And that is significant in this case because what it's allowing me to do is only pitch up the very, very, very front tiny piece of the note and then immediately pitch it down back to its root pitch very quickly. Here's what it sounds like with the decay slope up. It sounds high-pitched and weird and funky. So with the decay slope all the way down, it sounds more natural, but definitely punchier than this without it. So really important thing with the drums, guys, is to use those pitch envelopes. I've personally found that technique really valuable. So I'm pitching this one again, a couple semitones up to get it in key. Next up, we've got Gold Baby snares. Gold Baby is a sample pack that I really like. And it's basically 808s and 909s and stuff like that. And they have been recorded using tape saturation. And I just really like the quality and the timbre of the recordings, especially the tape saturation that goes on it. And so I have a bank of these that I use in my typical sound design. Again, listen to that. It's got that really like woody, thumpy thumpy bit to the front of the note, and a lot of that is coming from the pitch envelope. See, it's a nice sounding drum already. It's got some saturation in it, you can tell from that tape saturation. But when you put the pitch envelope on it, it really just takes it to the next level. Gives it a super thumpy front end. And again, you can see in our Spectrum plugin where it's tuned. So now that we've basically checked out all the sounds, oh wait, we forgot about the clap. Okay, can't forget about the clap. The clap is providing a much needed top and white noisy type of effect to the whole shebang. So there you go. I think I'm filtering it. Yeah, there you go. See, I have a high pass filter set up, so I'm removing all the low end because all the other drums are providing the low end. And that one is just providing a nice, hot, searing white noise kind of crack to the top end. So if we go back and you want to just listen to them all together, this is what it sounds like. Now we're going to dig into the effects that occur in the remainder of the chain after our drum rack. In the first slot, we have an audio effect rack. And what this audio effect rack is doing is taking advantage of Ableton's brilliant way of handling parallel processing. In pretty much any other program, I would have to route this signal out using sends and returns to be able to mix in parallel signals. But in this case, what I'm using is an audio effect rack, which just happens as an insert directly after the drum rack. What I have in here is, first of all, a dry band. This is just bypassing, you can see there's no effects, bypassing the dry signal all the way through. Then I have a transient shaper. This is the transient shaper I really enjoy. It's from Shaak Audio. And what I'm doing is I'm boosting the attack, so the very front end of that drum note. And then you can see I'm taking the release parameter down from its regular value here, and I'm dropping the release all the way down to 0. So what that's doing is it's adding a whole bunch of crack to the front end of the note. And I do this because later on in the chain, I'm going to be adding things like saturation and compression and limiting. And all of those things work to reduce the punch of drums in some cases, while increasing the overall loudness of the signal. And if I find later on that my drums are sounding a little bit too compressed or too limited, but I like how loud they are, for example, then I find this is helpful to add some crack back to the front end of the note that you can sometimes lose with that other type of processing. Next, we have a Camel Phat. Camel Phat is a very multi-talented plugin. It's got all kinds of stuff going on in it, but in this case, I have all the other modules turned off. And I'm just using it for a little bit of compression running in parallel. And more importantly, I'm using it for its distortion modules. And we have 4 choices here, but the one I'm using is I have the tube quite cranked. It's giving some really nice fat tube saturation. And let's just kind of solo each one of these bands. Here's our transient shaper. So compare that to the dry signal. So you can really hear it's just grabbing the front end and boosting that of the note. And then here's our Camel Phat. Okay, and here's them all together. And the reason why I like mixing things in parallel versus using each one of these effects perhaps as an insert afterwards is because it gives me very delicate control over the level of each one. And when I run effects in parallel, I find it really fattens up the drums in the same way that layering fattens up drums and in the same way that parallel processing fattens up bass or synthesizers. So I find that very useful to use as an effect here. Next up, we have the regular Ableton saturator. I wanted to add some extra grit to this snare drum. So we've got the analog clip, and I'm running it in parallel again using, in this case, the wet-dry function on the saturator. Next in line is our FabFilter Pro-Q. This is my favorite transparent EQ plugin. And there's a lot of reasons why I like it, but it's got a huge interface, which makes it very easy to use. It's got nice sharp cuts on the filters here. So I'm rolling off low frequencies that I don't need in the snare drum, but we're boosting the hell out of 200 hertz. And that, in this case, is tuned into the tune, and it's giving us a really nice fat snare sound. 200 hertz to 250 hertz is kind of like that's the domination region for snares. If you really want to make a heavy snare, you want to boost something in there, typically. And here's what it sounds like with and without. Okay, so when you hear it with the EQ on, it actually sounds a little bit more dull because what your ears are tuning into is those relatively low frequencies of 200 hertz. And that is where the magic of this little plugin comes in. This is a new favorite of mine, and this is the Vengeance Multi-band Compressor. And it's actually a multi-band compressor and multi-band limiter at the same time. And before explaining what it does, let me just let you hear it. This is without it. Here's with it. So any type of percussion in bass music or electronic music is going to need some type of compression and limiting to make it stand up against other tunes. And in this case, I'm using the Vengeance one because it gives me up to 4 different bands. So here I can select the number of bands. In this case, I'm using 4 bands, and I'm just muting the bottom band or bypassing it. And you can see I have crossover frequencies up here where I can determine the bandwidth and the extent of each region. And then in each band, I have the ability to dial in some very specific compression and limiting settings. So in this case, you can see here we have input signal, we have threshold, and we have gain reduction for the compressor. The compressor settings are right here. You have regular compression settings. You can go hard or soft knee. In this case, I'm using a hard knee there. You have ratio, you have attack, release, and then boost. And you can actually see in this meter, I have the meter set to gain reduction. So I can see how much gain reduction is happening from the limiter, and I can see how much gain reduction is happening from the compressor. And I'm trying to keep it relatively transient here, so I've backed off the attack times. Here, attack is 22 seconds or milliseconds. So it's leaving some of the front end of that note to come through still. And then what I'm doing is I'm boosting into the limiter. So the limiter doesn't have a threshold, as you can see, but the higher you boost here into the limiter, the more gain reduction you will get. And each of the bands is set up similarly. And then each band has an output control. And I'm using the output controls to act kind of like an EQ on the output of the signal. So it again allows me to balance each frequency range after compression and limiting. And the reason why I like a multi-band compressor and limiter on the snare drum specifically is because it gives me the ability to dial in different settings for different frequency ranges, which acts very different to a regular wideband compressor that will react to all frequencies. So I can use different attack and different release settings, different ratios, different knees on each one of the bands and really get each part of the frequency spectrum to pop based on what I'm trying to achieve. So I love this plugin for drums. It's a new favorite. I've been using it a lot on snare drums and on basses. So there we have the full snare system. Now, there's so much more I want to cover, but that's all we have time for today. So I do plan on doing some extra videos going into a bunch of the other sounds in this track. So keep an eye on the YouTube channel. And if you want first notification out of anyone, just sign up for my email list and I'll talk to you guys soon. Cheers.